welcome to Stowe Talks, a podcast designed to support people going through a relationship breakdown and all of the challenges this brings. I'm Matthew Taylor.
And I'm Liza Gatchell, family lawyers at Stowe Family Law. And today we're thrilled to welcome back Mr. Divorce Coach himself, Tom Nash. We're really excited about this podcast as Tom will be talking about coming out later in life and divorcing your heterosexual spouse. So welcome, Tom, back to the Stowe Talks podcast. Lovely to have you again. You've been with us a few times now, but for anybody that hasn't, and they should have done, but if they haven't listened to any of the previous episodes, do you want to just give us a recap and an introduction to yourself?
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much for having me back. I always love coming and talking to you guys as well, particularly the bit beforehand before we hit record.
No one gets to hear that.
No one gets to hear that, no. So for anybody that doesn't know me, my name's Tom Nash, otherwise known as Mr. Divorce Coach or the guy in the yellow chair. I'm one of few male divorce coaches in the UK. My area of focus is working with clients on things like their emotional regulation, helping people rebuild their mindset, and the practicalities of their separation or divorce, from things like co-parenting, which is episodes that we've done previously, to blended families, to effective communication, and a whole host of different things that all sit outside of the legal and financial sphere, but ultimately helping people to separate and divorce with a little bit more humility, compassion, and dignity.
Lovely. Great to have you back. Friend of the pod. So, really good to see you again. And today's topic is fascinating. I've been really looking forward to us talking about this one. So I think it's something that maybe people wouldn't think about unless you go through it or know someone who's gone through it. But once you do know someone who's gone through it, you realize what a big thing it is. So, obviously coming out is a big thing for anyone, but particularly either prior to, during, or after a divorce adds so many extra complications. So we've got a lot to get through. I mean, maybe let's start with, what are the sort of common reasons that people end up sort of coming out later in life? Is it that people have a change in sexuality? Is it that they maybe had that sexuality all along but got married anyway? What do you see in your sort of experience with clients and things?
Yeah, no, and it's a really valid question. I think before kind of just touching on it, I think that sometimes it's also about how do we talk about language as well. So we've obviously talked about this as coming out, but actually for a lot of people, and it speaks to a lot of the notion as to why people do it maybe later in life, actually it's tend to use the phrase actually letting in, because actually it is about not them coming out and sharing themselves with the world. It's actually about letting people in and letting them know who they really are, right? Starting to own who they are and really wanting to share that with the world. So I kind of like to kind of shift the phrase around a little bit. If you also look at kind of reasons, and a lot of reasons, and that might sit behind maybe what prohibited people from before from letting people in or coming out, we'll use those interchangeably today. There's a whole host of different scenarios and situations and reasons, and those can be things from like societal pressures and expectations. Even in 2025, people can still feel pressurized for societal norms or expectations, be that within fears of rejection from their family, it might be culturally, it might be a whole host of things, fear of judgment and rejection, as you say, or it might be down to things like where actually they've stayed within kind of those let's say, traditional cultural norms, or even kind of gender norms or whatever it might be, or even sexual orientation norms. And some of that also, and I've witnessed this with some clients quite often, actually, one of the things that can be quite prevalent for people that may be coming out later in life or letting in later in life is that there might actually be some underlying, what we call internalized homophobia. So where they have internalized over many, many years, those kind of negative messages that they might have experienced or witnessed or heard through friends, family, workplace, whatever it might be. And that's actually led to them to have feelings of self-shame, guilt, fears, being the butt of the joke, right? So actually they've then steered away from, and it's created this kind of internalized homophobia for them. So these are some of the reasons that maybe have held people back previously. And again, there's no kind of right or wrong. There's a lot of people, like you were saying, Matt, where actually it's always been there for them. I've worked with a number of couples where actually they've said, actually, I always felt this like this, even as a teenager or in my 20s, or those were thoughts that I put out of my head or I didn't explore, again, for a whole multitude of reasons. And then I think when we start to look at then maybe why people are deciding to let people in or come out later in life, it typically then starts to change around things like a desire for change, right? They're really maybe a little bit older. They're really starting to connect with who they are. They're starting to maybe do some self-reflection. They've probably had some ups and downs throughout their life by then, be that and again, I've experienced this with clients where there've been a multitude of triggers where the loss of a parent or a sibling, or a big change in their career, or a whole host of different things, or someone just comes into their life and they're seeing the world differently, and actually it just becomes like that desire for change in themselves, and because they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to start owning really who they are, and that kind of self-actualization and being authentically true to themselves, and maybe even to break some of those societal norms and to start being accepted for really who they are. And that process of self-actualization, I think, is quite common.
There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? If we go back, then you were sort of saying that they might have like pushed their feelings down, and they might have actually had perhaps feelings to somebody of the same sex going back to when they were a teenager, or going, throughout. It's not just something that necessarily, it's not a switch that's just suddenly come on in their 40s and they've suddenly decided. So what are the impacts of that, if you like, of having pushed that down, and how can people work through that to be confident in being able to let people in?
Yeah. Again, a whole host of things that can impact people where they're having that kind of suppression. And there's loads of different stats. We could sit here and talk about all the different statistics and research out there about things like direct correlation to kind of depressions, substance abuse, self-harm, etc., because of, again, those fears of maybe discrimination or whatever it might be. But the other thing that a lot of people I witness, particularly with my clients who are maybe a little bit older in life, kind of mid to later 30s or older, where they have been in a heterosexual relationship, you've then got all the other kind of fears that come into it that impact them, where they start to get affected by things like panic attacks and anxiety attacks and things like that, because the fear over having to own that when they've then got maybe young children or even adult children, and then the impacts maybe their social circles, their community, their friends, their workplace, and all those things being quite compounded for them, can have really severe impacts on their both physical and mental health.
That's a huge impact that it has on people, and they've got to kind of work through that. And there must be a lot of conflict, I guess, where if you are in a heterosexual marriage and you start having feelings for someone, or just generally for people of the same sex, there's got to be a lot of internal conflict there. People must sort of deny it to themselves, because the thought of having to tell your spouse that you want to end the marriage is obviously a huge thing. But I imagine it's really even heightened by saying, I want to end the marriage, and also my sexuality is not what it was, or has always been different to how you perceived it to be. And not only do I not want to be married, but also I now want to go into relationships with people of the same gender as me. Yeah, that's a lot of layering going on, isn't it?
Yeah, and both for the individual, but also for their spouse equally.
Yeah.
Because then they also have a lot of internal conflict with themselves about, right, so who they really were, right, that affected them. Like, this is something that I can't necessarily, it's not something we could work on per se in a marriage. I mean, to be fair, there actually are couples that I have worked with where actually that's re-established their relationship, and they've explored things like ethical non-monogamy, etc., so on and so forth, which might be another topic for another day. But it affects both parties, about that internal conflict. So for the individual themselves, it is about like that denial, that suppression, that fear to be true to themselves, how to bring that forward. And very often, more often than not, the clients that I'm working with who are experiencing this and are coming to me with this particular challenge and unique challenge, is that, and again, like a lot of other clients that come to me, they desperately don't want to hurt their spouse. They really don't want to hurt them. They actually do love them, right? Just differently, and not maybe how they once did. And again, that can also cause a lot of confusion for both individuals around what the past was, what was real, right? Was it all a lie? And things like that. So there's a whole host of different things that come up for people, and it can be a real struggle to kind of get their head around that, and particularly where children are involved as well, right? Because then you've also got another conversation, or number of conversations, and how to deal with that dynamic, and how their children are going to cope with that as well.
Yeah, we'll come back to children in a minute. Just something that I was thinking about. I was trying to go through a sort of thought experiment and trying to wonder how I might feel if it happened to me, if I was, married to a woman who then decided that she wanted to go into a lesbian relationship. And I mean, I don't know, because I don't think you can know until you go through it, but I had two opposing reactions. My first reaction was, and this is probably a bit of male ego speaking, oh my God, what have I done to turn my spouse gay? And then the second reaction was, well, actually, do you know what, if this were to happen to me, would I just think, well, if that's the way she feels and there's nothing I can do to change that? And, is there some sort of blame absolution? Am I sort of in the clear on blame there? I mean, I don't know if I would feel either of those things or something completely different. I mean, are those common emotions, common reactions? Which way do people go?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because again, I've seen that with the spouse of the partner.
Yeah.
Again, when working with couples, and absolutely nail on the head, where it's actually that confusion, and again that kind of internal conflict and dialogue with themselves, the self-questioning, right, and the self-critique of what did I do, what didn't I do, right, etc. But then the flip side of that, of going, that must have been a part of them that they have always had. And actually, I've had a lot of clients where have said, actually, in their session with the spouse, where they've actually said, that actually makes me really sad to feel and now to know that my partner of 5, 10, 25 years, there's always been this part of them that actually I didn't know, and they didn't feel safe enough or comfortable enough. And not because their spouse has purposely created that environment, but because for a number of other reasons they just didn't feel safe enough to actually share that part of them with them. And for a lot of the spouses that I work with, and this on this flip side of the coin, that's a big kind of consideration of, that's quite sad that actually that person hasn't been able to be their true authentic them, and actually I can still love them differently as well. And again, it takes time and a lot of work, and that person also has to rebuild their identity, their purpose, their focus. They then start to question themselves as well, and what's really true and important to them.
There's a lot to unpack, isn't there? There's a lot to go through. So if somebody has been feeling this way, is thinking about having a conversation with their spouse, what preparation should they be doing for that conversation, and what should they be considering when they're having it?
One of the things that I always kind of work with people beforehand is actually helping them to get to a place of like having the safe talk, right? So that they feel safe. That's ultimately the most important thing here, is how safe do they feel? Who's maybe the safest person to speak to first? In an ideal world, yes, we would love for them to be able to be talking to their spouse first, most importantly. But actually, sometimes, do they need to build that up? Are they coming to me for that? Are they going to a friend, a sibling, whatever it might be? But maybe who's that first safe person in that first safe place? Helping clients to think about, how will they tell them? How they create an emotionally safe place to open up. And it can also then start to help them think about things like their emotional safety, economical safety, and then what do they need to consider about their spouse as well, right? Where and when is possibly the best time and place, and how to go about this? What's the right wording and the right phrasing? But it's also helping the client to then think about and prepare for, what are all those eventualities and outcomes? What do they need to be cognizant of? Again, that big fear that we kind of mentioned earlier on about rejection, the loss, people that might be gone from your world. And that's a really common thing, whether someone is letting out or coming in at later in life or earlier in life. A lot of people have those big fears about who they might lose, friends, family, so on and so forth. So again, just helping people to be mindful and cognizant about all that preparation. So yeah, who might they go and talk to first? At what point would be a better time to be talking to their partner, to their spouse? What would they like to say? How would they like to say it? How do we ensure that there isn't blame and accusation, that there's reassurance in there? Also, what's their level of comfort with vulnerability? How much do they want to share? And in that first conversation, and again, like with any client of any sexual orientation that's going for a separation or a divorce, it's never just one conversation. There's going to be many afterwards as well. So how open does the client feel about sharing that experience of denial, what they have suppressed? Is it the ending of their relationship, or as I mentioned about a few clients where they've kind of then reevaluated their relationship and maybe bend their relationship to evolve and be slightly different? So again, just helping the client understand, like, what is it that what's the purpose, and what do they want to achieve out of it, and how do we also be mindful and cognizant and compassionate about the flip side and the other person in this experience, right? Express their care, but also helping them understand the B word that us coaches, counselors, therapists use, the boundaries in that first conversation. What do they want to share? What do they not want to? What are the ground rules around that? And then discussing what those potential outcomes in the immediacy as well, particularly if they're cohabitating, they've got children. one thing that I always say to a lot of people is also building a little bit of a safe exit strategy if they need to. If it really came to it, where would they be able to go if they needed to? If it was really difficult, where would they go? Who else knows? Safety at all times is paramount.
On the timing point, what about if someone has already separated, already had the discussion without dealt with their sexuality, and they might not have felt able to have that conversation, or perhaps it was only after separation, maybe they started dating again and they started to explore their sexuality and realized that they did want to experience a same-sex relationship, and then come to have that conversation at a later point. So you've already had the initial "I don't think I want to be married" conversation. Perhaps, obviously we know the trauma that goes with that.
Yeah.
Perhaps things calm down a bit, but then it happens later, and then you have to have that conversation either just because you feel like you need to, or because there's children involved, and then we can talk in a little bit about introducing children to the concept. How does that change things when you're dealing with, it's almost a second peak of that conversation. The first conversation is the peak of "I don't want to be married to you."
Yeah.
The second peak is, "Oh, by the way, also, my sexuality isn't what you thought it was."
Yeah, 3, 6, 9, 24 months down the line, actually.
Yeah.
This is me. I found myself, and this is the person that I am. It can still have quite dependent on what stages they're at, both formally as well as informally, particularly again, as you say, if there are children involved, because that is going to be one of the primary reasons for sharing that if you're 6, 9, 12 months down the road of a separation or a divorce, depending on what that connectivity between the two parties still is. But again, you're still going to have a lot of those points that we were talking about before about confusion, internal conflict, right? The self-critique and reflective piece of how did I not know, or did I see that before? Or quite often, I always suspected, I always thought there was something there. Right? And again, that can be quite a common response as well. What I have found with clients, whether it be one-to-ones or if it's been with couples, when it's been further down the initiation of the actual separation or divorce, is that there tends to be a little bit more understanding and acknowledgement at that point for a lot of people, because they've actually already started to do a lot of the emotional release and emotional processing about the relationship and the two of them as a unit. And they've already started a lot of that self-reflective work, and they've started to build some resilience and confidence in themselves, and looking at, well, what part did I play in that, etc., and like what was my contribution and accountability, and already going through that emotional process. So actually, for a lot of my clients, actually see that can bring a lot more understanding, and it can actually, I've witnessed this with a couple of clients actually, it's actually one thing that has helped to actually lessen the conflict that was still there in the formalities through the financial negotiations with the lawyer, with their mediator, because actually now it's actually brought that whole point about understanding. Now I can understand, now I can get it right, now it's different, we can start to move forward. And I've actually seen that it's been able to help turn the temperature dial down for a number of clients as well.
That's really interesting, and not something I would have necessarily thought of, actually, that it was capable of turning it down rather than just turning it up. I mean, one of the things that you mentioned was that one of the reasons why you might have this conversation with somebody that you're separating from, because, I mean, arguably, if you're separating, perhaps you don't need to kind of share your soul with them. But one of the important factors why you might be having this conversation is that you've got children. And so it's not just about then having a conversation with your ex-partner. It's also going to be about sitting down and having a conversation with the children. And how that conversation goes is probably going to depend on the ages of the children that you've got. But what's your advice and tips with regards to that? Because that's probably going to be sort of the next stage after you've spoken to your spouse.
And again, it's about, are they working together, and can we have this talk with the kids together? And again, regardless of sexual orientation, you've probably witnessed this with a lot of your clients, right? There is quite often that client says, no, you tell them, this is on you. You're the one that needs to own this. You take it forward. So if we can actually have this talk together with the kids, it's then also then thinking about, well, okay, so what are those potential impacts the kids, right? Let's just kind of disassociate and step back for a moment. So think like, what's going to be their confusion or uncertainty? And again, all age related and age appropriately, what might be their fears and anxieties, right? What might be their impacts to their world? Give you a kind of, let's say, a real life example. What happens if they live in quite a close knit rural area? And I had some clients where they lived in a very remote area. The whole town was intergenerational, and it was very, very close knit. They used to actually describe it to me as like it was like a miniature Coronation Street in the 50s. Everybody knew everybody's business. So they had to think about the nuances and the uniquenesses of telling their children who their class sizes were like 10 people as opposed to 30 people? Did they have the same kind of insights through the school's kind of PSHE and life skills and things like that? So thinking about all those different changes, what might be changes in family dynamics? Do we need to kind of pay attention to behavioural shifts and changes with the kids? But same set of skills as when we're talking to our spouse about levels of honesty and vulnerability, actively listening, paraphrasing, repeating back what we've heard so that we can confirm and clarify, right? Validate their emotions as well. It's okay for them to be confused, scared, sad, angry, whatever it might be for them, but help to validate those emotions as well. But where do we build in and provide that reassurance? Same as we would do when we're having any other conversation with our children and bringing that in. And then the next steps is things like education. How do we start to have more open, wider conversations with our kids to create, again, more emotionally intelligent discussions, more empathetic human discussions to create more understanding, because that then helps us set the frame for what about when our kids are older and they're going through something and they're experiencing something in life that they've maybe been suppressing or holding back from. And actually, if we're creating that space for them through our action and behavior about how we've brought something that's really challenging situation to deal with, we can then kind of set that frame about and create that space for them to let them know that actually they can come and talk to us about absolutely anything.
You're being like super reasonable.
Yeah.
But we all know that sometimes not everybody is super reasonable. So I suppose both for you and perhaps Matt from the legal side of things as well, a situation where you've told your spouse they're hurt, they're emotional, and their gut reaction is you are not to tell the children. You're not to tell the children. You're not to have contact with the children. That's it, like cutting it off. Tom, your advice on that. And then obviously if we come over to Matt, perhaps you can give us the like legal input in it.
Well, I was actually going to say that depending on how difficult and challenging that get is, you've got to seek that external support as well, right? You can't do these things on your own. So seeking that external professional support, whether that's within kind of from the emotional processing experience of it and practical challenges of hashing things out and figuring out some different ways and different approaches with someone like myself or colleagues of mine in coaching and counselling. But also then looking at, well, what are actually the legal implications and what things do we need to think about if it's descending and it's becoming really challenging and disruptive and they're not getting to see the kids, they're not being able to have those opportunities to talk to them and create that space. So we've then got to kind of look toward what are the mechanisms that can support the client formally and possibly having to take the path of the legal route and coming speaking to someone like yourselves.
I think the legal question is interesting, and I'll be honest, I don't completely know the answer. I can't say it's something that I've ever dealt with where there's been a dispute about whether someone should be able to tell their children about their sexuality. So I think the primary point is it's an area of parenting discretion would be the starting point for most people, and the court would say it's a parenting decision. It's not really one that the court should necessarily get involved with. I can, however, perceive of a situation where the court might get involved, and that's only where in telling them or in being prevented from telling them there is a harm to the child's welfare. And I think you'd probably need relatively extreme circumstances for that. So the thing that kind of leaps to mind is where the court might want to get involved, and you might be looking at, let's say, one partner wants to prevent their ex-partner from telling the children about their sexuality, could apply for a prohibited steps order to prevent a parent from sharing that information. In one of those applications, the courts are only going to make an order to protect a child's welfare. So something like if the children were brought up in an extremely religious upbringing, a very traditional branch of one of the major religions where the discussion of homosexuality might cause them harm because of the views within that particular community about homosexuality, I could perceive that perhaps there might be grounds for an application there for either a prohibited steps order or the reverse, a specific issue order to permit it, because I could see there could potentially be some risk of harm to the children. But this is very much me thinking at the top of my head, so thank you, Lisa, for springing this one on me. I appreciate it greatly.
Love to put you on the spot, Matt.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to bounce it back at you and see if you've got a better idea than me. Or have I just talked nonsense, or has that got any legs?
I think the reality is that both parents have parental responsibility, or we're going to assume in this case that both parents have parental responsibility.
Yeah.
So you have to make decisions on behalf of your child, exercising your parental responsibility. Now, if they can't agree on something like a school, etc., then, there are applications that can be made to court. I think the problem with telling the children is that I think by the time you get an application in, what's probably going to happen is that the parent that wants to do it's already done it.
Yeah.
So it's already happened. And I think the reality is that there isn't very much that the other parent would be able to do to genuinely stop that conversation happening unless there was no contact taking place. And obviously, if there's no contact taking place, then that's a separate application for a child arrangements order. And that may well be one of the reasons that the other parent puts in their application defending that, is that, I don't think contact's in their best interest because they're going to say X, Y, and Z. But I don't think, I would be, like you say, Matt, I think I'd be very shocked in today's society if a court turned around and said, yes, no, we agree there should be no contact with your children because your sexuality has changed.
And it brings in all sorts of Article 8 rights and all sorts of things. So obviously the balance is tipped towards parents having contact with their children and acceptance that, in general, in sort of British society, people don't have a problem with people being homosexual. Perhaps in certain communities, there might be a slight pause for thought.
I can see the court getting involved more when it comes to new partners. So if one parent's saying, well, you can't introduce new partner to the children, and then having to make a specific issue application. But equally, we have cases, unfortunately, where by the time you've made the application, the partner's already been introduced. And again, you have to show that the child's welfare is at risk with that partner. So it can't just be that partner's sexuality. It has to be, that they've got criminal convictions, they're on the sex offenders register. There has to be something really obvious that puts that child at risk for the court to prevent a partner being introduced.
I would explore working it back with a client to help, again, if this was a hypothetical client, depending on how the communication is between the parties, to kind of go back to basics of creating understanding. What's the reasoning behind it? But then also chunking down and looking underneath those surface level layers of trying to explore and get the client to explore what's that kind of top level layer as to their spouse's reasoning as to not tell the children. But then how do we chunk down and get underneath it and see what that potential root cause is? And is it actually something that is more pragmatic about timing or ages, or because their school summer holidays is coming up and there was already these plans? Or is there actually a fundamental reason that they're hooked to as to why? But then we can start to explore, well, how do we work around that challenge, right? And what's a different approach to it? And actually, is that a case of because they want us to take the ownership and they want us to go and share that and they want us to kind of take that blame, as it were? Or is it because they actually want to be involved and they want to understand what that messaging is? So it's just trying to get underneath a few layers of what is the reticence from their spouse to not tell the children. And is it about, as you say, welfare concerns to the kids? In this real life, this comes up where I'm worried they're going to get picked on at school.
In a similar vein to Lisa's previous question, which started with, Tom, you always sound very reasonable. I was going to say at the same time, Tom, you always sound incredibly calm and make this sound really easy. And you have a wonderful gift to making things sound positive. But my then follow on from that question was, no one's perfect. These conversations, we have a roadmap, whatever it is, people know what they want to do, but no one hits it perfectly. What are the things, though, to avoid? What are the mistakes that someone might make in a conversation like this and they should be watchful for?
When I was talking about vulnerability earlier, honesty is one, and being forthright, being honest to own who they really are without blame. And I see this a lot where then it can still come in terms of accusation and where people have been pushed back and they still trying to make it somebody else's fault. And again, that can really derive a lot of conflict, right? When you're kind of like pointing the finger at them, but there's three pointing back at you. A lot of those pitfalls are around like how are they showing up and coming to this discussion? Because again, I've seen this quite a lot where there hasn't been that open and that honesty from them. They then feel worse themselves that they haven't been as honest as they would have liked, potentially. And it's typically always something that comes back and causes further friction and conflict with them as well. The other thing is go and explore the different forms of support. We were going to do a bit of signposting as well and share some links, but go and find some support resources. There are support resources out there on whichever side of this experience you're on. Go and become educated. Go and talk to other professionals and go and talk to other people from those communities as well, from the LGBTQ plus community. Go and learn and understand to expand yourself.
Tom, well, as you know, being a frequent flyer on this show, we always like to wrap up with some top tips for people. So, if someone's about to go through this, about to have the conversation, is, exploring their own sexuality and really isn't sure it's compatible with their continued marriage, or they've come out of a marriage and they are exploring their sexuality now, what are your sort of top tips for people to have a think about?
Become educated about the LGBTQ plus community. Really start to understand who you are, because then actually that's going to help you to be a more effective communicator when it comes to having these talks with your spouse, with your children, with extended friends, family, and then go and have a look at things like effective communication tools and going and working with the right professionals, and to explore what are all those potential pitfalls, what are all the things that we need to consider and think about, and really just be confident, get to the space where actually you're safely confident in being who you are, to be able to share who you are, but safely, as I said earlier.
Some great tips there. So that's it for this episode of Stowe Talks. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about Tom on his website, mrdivorcecoach.co.uk, or follow him on all the usual social media channels. If you would like more information on our podcast, head over to stowetalks.co.uk and please rate, like, share and review this podcast where you can.